Round about the time that Heroes the album came out, I used to have this fantasy about meeting Bowie, who was, at that time, my personal hero. He'd be sitting there in some bar or cafe, smoking those ultra-cool, filterless Gitane cigarettes that I kept on trying, although they always fucked over my throat. And I'd walk over and I'd say, "Hello, David," or "Hello, Dave," or "Hello, Mr. Bowie," or perhaps just "Hello." And somehow we'd fall into a really interesting conversation about something or other, and we'd just hit it off in some inexplicable way and have a really good laugh together. And somewhere along the line I'd say something really clever about something or other, and he'd stop and he'd say, "Wait a minute," and he'd get out his notebook and he'd make a note about that really witty or clever thing that I'd just said. And he'd say that I'd given him a great idea for this song or album or whatever, and maybe I could give him my phone number and we could meet up and talk it through properly sometime. And then a few weeks later I'd get this call, and of course it would be him, and he would say that he was having a problem with a song and maybe I could come along and help him out with it. Except that, and you have to understand that this is really important, he was in Berlin and he couldn't really make it over to England right now, but he would send a car round to pick me up and take me to the airport if that was okay with me. And I'd say, well, fine, no problem. And there wouldn't be a problem because I'd just say to my parents that I had to go to Berlin for the weekend and they would just say fine, and my mum wouldn't even do that embarrassing thing about making me call them when I got there just to prove that I was okay. And anyway, I get picked up by this big fuck-off limousine. And in fact, it would be the exact same one that they'd used in that film, The Man Who Fell to Earth. And I'd get driven to the airport, and then I'd get in this private jet, and I'd be flown to Berlin. And this is very important. You have to understand that this Berlin was a very strange place. Because for one thing, it was all in monochrome to make it more romantic. And everybody that lived there was either a spy or an artist. And it was mostly raining in a kind of romantic way, or foggy, or something like that. Romantic. And it would be late night by the time the plane got to Berlin, and we'd come down through the clouds and the whole city would be laid out in lights beneath us. And then we'd land, and I'd be rushed through customs and stuff, and then I'd be met at the gate by Dave or David. And we'd probably just drive about a bit in the romantic monochrome rain, and he'd tell me about the problem that he was having with this song. And I'd sort it out for him just by making a few simple suggestions, like that he ought to change the melody a bit, or maybe I'd scribble down a few lyrics on my packet of Gitane that wouldn't, for some reason, hurt my throat anymore. And some years later, that same packet of cigarettes would sell for thousands and thousands at some auction of rock memorabilia as the first example of Robin Arthur's collaboration with David Bowie. And Dave, or David, would shake his head and he'd say something like, "God, you make it all seem so simple." And then he'd laugh and he'd say that we should get back to the house, which would be this really cool apartment somewhere. because there were some people that he wanted me to meet. And we'd get back to the apartment, which would be this brilliant place that was all kind of minimalist and decadent at the same time. And then he'd introduce me to Iggy Pop, who'd be there, and also to the guys from Kraftwerk and some really good-looking girls. And we'd all get along really well. And sometime later we'd just all jam along together, and for some reason I'd really be able to play the guitar properly and my fingers wouldn't get all mixed up when I changed the chords. And in fact, a few years later, in some interview, Iggy would say that, you know, it was probably the greatest music he ever made. But, you know, you just had to have been there because you couldn't really describe how great it was. It was just like an experience. And later, I'd be out on the balcony just getting a breath of fresh air and thinking about how my life had changed, and that I probably wouldn't really need to go back to school now that I was some kind of a rock star. And of course the romantic rain would have stopped for a while, and Dave, or David, would come out too, and we'd just kind of hang out together, smoking. And he'd say that he liked all the other guys, Iggy and the guys from Kraftwerk and all his other rock star friends, but that I was the one that he got on with best, because I just seemed to have the knack of saying such interesting and clever things, and besides he just felt kind of more relaxed with me. And in any case, if I had the time, then he'd really like to work with me on the next album. And it would be like a kind of proper collaboration and everything, and my name would be on it too, like the new album from David Bowie and Robin Arthur, or the new album from Robin Arthur and David Bowie. And I'd be kind of a bit cool about it, and I'd say something like, well, I'd have to check out and see if I really had time. But of course, I knew that I would really do it with him. And from this day on, my life would be completely and utterly different. And that I would have to learn how to deal with all the shit that goes with being famous, like the paparazzi and the fan mail, and all the stupid, boring questions from the rock journalists who wouldn't really understand what the work was about, although they'd obviously understand that it was great stuff. And even the crazy, sad stalker types who'd get fixated on me and try to follow me around. But, you know, I was prepared to deal with all of that shit. And I knew that I'd always stay clear of the whole drug thing and not crash and burn like so many of the others, because I would always be able to come back here to Berlin and just hang out with my new best friend.